Welcome to Tales from the Trenches Tuesdays. Today, it is my honor to have Andrew Olsen with us.
Here's a story of a fundraiser who was launching his very own web show. Each episode is very short due to edits, so it can really flow. Here's a story of a podcast guest star who was busy raising money of their own. They were each great in their own way, fundraising in its own. Till the one day when Jack asked a guest to join him, and they knew it was much more than a jest, that these guests must somehow form a resource. That's the way they all became the podcast guests. The podcast guests, the podcast guests. That's the way they became the podcast guests.
Andrew is an Executive Vice President of Fundraising Solutions at DickersonBakker. In that capacity, he leads both the firm's direct response fundraising agency and their major gift consulting and messaging practice. He's on a mission to help nonprofit leaders become more effective so they can make a greater impact in the world. Throughout his 25-year career, he served over 1,000 nonprofits in the U.S. and Canada and helped them raise more than $1 billion. Andrew and his wife of 24 years are raising their 3 daughters on a small family farm in East Tennessee. So welcome, Andrew.
Hey, Jack, it's good to be here with you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, wow. So, we've seen fundraising kind of change a lot more in the States than it has in Canada. Canada's a little bit slow and reticent to change. But the future of philanthropy is obviously going to be much different in the future than it is today. And part of it is addressing those kind of systemic inequalities that have existed for tons of racialized communities. As two white guys talking here, it's a little bit peculiar. Right. But have you kind of seen some of the startings of I don't want to say a revolution, but startings of a change process?
That's a tough one. I think that there are places where that is happening, right? But I don't feel like I see it. I feel like I see a lot more window dressing and a lot more talk about change than I see actual change. I would say in the States, there's a few people I think who are really kind of leading the charge on this. So Armando Zamaya, I don't know if you know him or not. He would be one. Kishana Palmer, Amira Barger. She's now, I think, in a commercial role, but still on many boards and a leading voice in the space around this. Michelle Flores as well. I think they're really starting to ask the hard questions and to push organizations and leaders to think differently. What I see, though, is that, and I think this goes back to the business model in the charitable sector and to the fact that we're so used to living paycheck to paycheck. To do what they're talking about and what people are suggesting around this is going to require that you have a little bit more aptitude, or not aptitude, a little more willingness to take a risk, right? So I was talking yesterday with someone else about this, and they said, we want to transform our donor base so that they don't all look like you and me. And I said, well, that's great, except you have to understand that right now, when you go out and build a model to find next year's new donors, you're literally building what's referred to in the marketplace as a lookalike model. And so a lookalike model means people that you get tomorrow are going to look a lot alike the people you have today, right? And unless we're willing to break that mold and to say, we're actually going to intentionally go outside of that audience to reach new audiences that look different, that behave differently, that have different values and different ways of giving, you're going to end up with the same thing tomorrow, right? And I feel the same way about the talent-based inside organizations. If you only ever do a job search by looking at, these 2 or 3 sources to find candidates, you are never going to diversify your candidate pool, right? And same at the board level. I mean, I have walked into boards of organizations that are serving really diverse communities and looked around and been like, all right, that's 9 white dudes and 1 white woman, right? There you go for diversity, right? Like, if that's what we think that means, then I think that there's a big gap between our expectation and what we're going to see in reality. So Amira Barger is a longtime friend of mine. You know, we talk when we get an opportunity to chat and update with each other. Like there's something to be said for this idea of like, who's speaking your name in a room that you don't have access to, right? And who's creating a seat at the table where you don't have a seat already. And so if guys like us aren't doing that and not creating the opportunity, then, you know, it's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like we're going to sit there and say, well, this community is not diverse enough. Well, if you keep a lock on the door, of course it's not, right? And I don't know that I see enough organizations opening that door differently.
No, I think you're quite right. So let's talk a little bit about, we call it canvassing here in Canada, or it's solicitation in the States and the UK.
Okay.
Whenever I hear the word solicitation, I always think of prostitution. So we go by canvassing.
And you don't mean canvassing like street canvassing where you're stopping somebody?
No, I mean,
is that what you're
no, I
talking
mean like a major gift canvas.
Okay,
right, or something like
Yep.
that. So tell me about the best canvas that you were ever on and what made it the best canvas. It doesn't need to be the one that was the most successful dollars and cents. What made it successful?
Yeah. So the one that comes to mind, the most memorable for me, and I've told this story a number of times, but I went with a friend of mine who was, excuse me, he was the actual gift officer soliciting the gift at the time. I was running the organization's annual fund at the time, and we went and visited this farmer in central Minnesota. That's where I lived, just where the hospital was that we were working for. Just so happened that the farmer that we visited, I actually lived in a condo that was part of a development that used to be his sweet pea crop until he sold it off and made a boatload of money, right? But he's still an active farmer, probably in his 70s. He and his wife lived in a little, one-story ranch house that probably hadn't been updated since 1978, year I was born. And she was in what was very clearly a handmade dress. He was in a pair of dirty overalls, dirty flannel shirt, ball cap that probably said, farm co-op or something like that. And he drove up to the house when we were to meet him in a pickup truck that looked like it probably hadn't had any love and care taken to it in the last 15, 20 years. So we walked into their home, sat down at their kitchen table, chit-chatted a little bit, and then we got into our solicitation presentation. And I asked him at one point, and the hospital that I was working in was a pediatric hospital that dealt with a lot of kids with traumatic injuries or other long-term conditions, right? And they also had a very large prosthetics laboratory that built prosthetics for kids all over the Midwest. So I said to him at one point in our conversation, why do you support our hospital? What is it that's important to you? And he got this little smirk on his face, and he lifted up his pant leg on his overalls and had a prosthetic. Oh, wow. And he said, I just want kids to have it better than I had growing up, right? And that's when it hit me, excuse me, just how personal the giving decision is for most people who are charitable, right? And it's not about the passion pitch that we made. It's not that we had great 5-point plan. I mean, those things are all like valuable and stuff, but it was the fact that this guy could say, you know what? I see myself in all those little faces of the kids that you are serving today, and I want to make it better for them. And it was just a great lesson for me in that process.
Wow. And it sticks with you, right? So it's something you'll never forget.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the flip side of that. We've all had canvases that have gone off the rails, and you're like, oh my gosh, I wish I could do that one over again. So tell me about one that didn't go so well.
Yeah. So I worked for a number of years with some organizations that maybe were a little bit more fringe politically. And I got exposure to a lot of unique donors because of that. And I remember sitting down with one donor who I don't know what the donor did for a living, but I'm fairly certain that most of it wasn't legal. And the way that I discovered this, and as we started talking about it, is that the gift that he wanted to structure, he essentially said, I want to give you a gift in this amount, but I only want you to keep this amount, and I want you to refund me for the remainder of it. And so as far as I could tell, I'm pretty sure that was a request for money laundering.
Yeah.
And he seemed to think that like it was just the normal thing that charities did. And so like obviously like we walked away at that point, didn't go any further in the conversation, removed him from all of our, engagement lists, all that kind of thing. But I remember thinking to myself, like, how do people get such an assumption of like what it means to be a charity? Just this idea that like, I'm just going to use you as my personal clearinghouse and expect that you will wash my cash for me. And so, yeah, that one was probably the weirdest one. I mean, I've had others. I've had a few where people got really angry and felt like they hadn't been listened to and things like that. And it had soured the relationship. But the most memorable odd one was that gentleman.
So, it's interesting because you come away from, sometimes these canvases or solicitations, as you guys call it, are pretty profound, and you learn some pretty amazing things because the donor, if it goes well, is actually inviting you into kind of their inner sanctum, where they're a little bit vulnerable. And I always walk away saying, hey, I kind of learned something, whether it was about the donor or whether I learned something just about a perspective in the world. So I always find that, I learn things from donors. Is there something that you've learned from a donor from one of your visits?
Absolutely. I mean, I've learned a number of different things. I've learned business ideas and leadership ideas, and feel like a couple of the relationships I've had over time have almost developed into like, whether they whether they realize it or not, almost like business mentorships even, right? One of the ones that was the most profound though was just about like taught me how to think about caring for people and putting their needs ahead of ours. So I had this one woman who would give a gift anytime she intersected with our charity. So if she came to an event, she would give a gift. If she were personally solicited, she would get a gift. She would give a gift. If you called to say thank you, she would say, hey, I want to send another gift. All those kind of things, right? So I called and talked with her one day, and as we were having the conversation, she said to me, one of the reasons I still give to you is because you're not presumptive about my giving. And I said, well, tell me more about what you mean by that. And she said, you call just to say thank you. And you call just to check on me. She said, I used to give to this other organization, and every time they called, they would say that, but then they would ask for money. And if they invited me somewhere, it was always under the pretense of asking for money. She said, I came to feel like all they ever cared about was my money. And so I just shifted my giving, and I now give, a third to you, a third to this organization, a third to that organization, instead of a quarter to four of you. And, excuse me. And she said, if you play your cards right, you're going to get half my estate when I pass. And she was an elderly woman, and she made a joke about it. She said, you don't have to wait too long. It'll be just a few years. But her point was, she felt like the other organization that she had supported for many years and that her husband had supported before he passed, she felt like it was super transactional, right? And so she said, it became not any fun anymore to talk to them because they always wanted something. They always showed up with their hand out. And so the hard lesson there for me, and the lesson that I shared with our team, was like, you have got to just invest, right? And yes, there's a time for asking, and it's not inappropriate to ask, but we need to give many more times before we ask if we want this to be successful.
Yeah. Like Lynn Wester calls it fasking, right? When you think and ask in the same breath, and it's a horrible thing. But I certainly have used that phrase. But it's interesting. The reason why I don't use the phrase solicitation and I use canvas is because you do something and it's a financial transaction when you're dealing with a prostitute. When all you're doing is asking for money, you're kind of a prostitute.
Yeah. I think that, and my opinion on this has matured over time, but I really think that our role as fundraisers is to invite people into something.
Yeah, we're
right?
facilitators.
It shouldn't be about soliciting. It shouldn't be about hitting up. It shouldn't be all those things, right? We should be inviting people to make a difference in the world.
Right. Andrew, what do boards and bosses, what should they be looking at that they're currently not looking at when it comes to fundraising?
Wow. Okay, that's an interesting one. Yeah, I think what I see is that boards in particular are stuck looking at metrics that don't matter anymore. And what I mean by that is if you're looking at things like how many likes did a Facebook post get, or how many butts and seats did you have at a rubber chicken dinner, or what your direct mail acquisition response rate was, those don't matter. None of those meaningfully impact your long-term potential, right? And far too few boards are looking at and challenging the metrics that actually matter. Like, what is our staff retention? And how about, is our staff happy to be here or not, right? What would our staff recommend us to other people who are looking for jobs in their networks? Because if we get that right, what I know is if I treat my people well, they will in turn treat my customers well, and that will result in increased revenue and profit for my organization. And the same math is true for a charity, right? Whether it's a customer or a donor, a business or a charity, if you treat your people well, they'll care well for those that you care for, and that will increase your revenue and profit. So I think boards need to first and foremost be paying attention to that. I think they need to be paying deep attention to what the culture is in the organization, and they actually need to be investing in making it better. And then I think from a revenue and a financial performance perspective, we need to be looking at things like, what is the long-term revenue, the long-term value per donor? Where can we create asset pools in our organization so that we're actually putting capital on the sidelines and saying, we're not going to spend it today because we're going to invest it differently and grow it so that we can have an outsized impact in the future, right? And then the other one that I think a lot of organizations miss is what percentage of our supporters are converting their cash giving to asset giving? And how can we capitalize on that so that we can both grow the wealth under management at our organization and increase retention in the process?
Wow. That is some amazing tidbits. Unbelievable. Andrew, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me. If folks wanted to get hold of you, how would they go about doing that?
Yeah, one of the easiest places is LinkedIn. I'm there all the time. Or Andrew at DickersonBakker, and that's Baker with 2 Ks.com.
Amazing. Thank you so much for your time, Andrew.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Enjoyed the conversation.
Hi, folks. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button right here.